Elias Mercer learned early how the desert keeps its own counsel, how heat folds space until the horizon blurs and the sun becomes an accusation. At 50, the skin on his face read like old leather, mapped by hard years in sun and wind. The Mercer place squatted on a quiet wash just outside Dry Creek, a working ranch more necessity than pride, a low house with a porch that sagged in the middle, a barn smelling of hay and horses, and fences that needed mending every season. The life he kept up there was a series of chores practiced until they could be done half asleep: milk the mare, check the trough, ride the north boundary, mend the fence where rustlers had broken it last winter. Those motions were medicine and anesthesia. They filled his days with noise and purpose without asking anything of his heart. Elias had once known a different kind of light. Eleanor, soft-spoken, quick with a laugh that could stop 3 men on the porch, had been his world. In the hush between the cattle calls and the whisper of cottonwood leaves, they had dreamed of a house full of footsteps, of a little boy who would run through the yard with his mother's eyes and Elias's stubborn jaw. But the desert does some terrible things. 2 summers ago, Eleanor died bringing a son who slept at the edge of life and never woke. The empty cradle became a monument in the corner of the bedroom, and the house filled with the sound of its own absence. Elias's grief hardened into a daily companion. He did not drink much, only a little whiskey when the nights shouted too loudly, and he spoke to no one but the animals and the wind. So when he rode into Dry Creek on a day that melted the lacquer off the boards, it was for supplies: coffee beans, a sack of oats, bullets, and the kind of bottle that made noise soft at midnight. He tied his buckskin outside Murphy's General and moved through the town like a man who preferred to be invisible. Dry Creek was a half-finished idea of civilization. A main street of sun-bleached signs, a livery where men argued over horses, and the Scarlet Lily, with bat-wing doors that sighed when they were pushed open. The place smelled like old perfume and cheap liquor. Laughter, rough as gravel, rolled out from the dance hall. Lanterns swung and threw loose, hungry shadows. Elias had meant only to slip inside, buy what he needed, and leave. Instead, the lantern light snagged on a figure he would not be able to forget. She stood by the piano, small and oddly out of rhythm with the painted women who laughed too loud and flirted with practiced movements. Her hair was a copper ribbon, pinned back with a plain comb. Her dress, a faded blue once the color of spring, was neat, not the gaudy finery of the others. Most of the girls in the Scarlet Lily wore the world as armor. This one wore something else: endurance. Her eyes were green and too old for the rest of her face. She moved like someone who had learned to make her way, through rooms by reading the air, sensing where danger clustered and where it could be avoided. Elias watched her flinch when a hand that had no business touching a waist slid too close. The way she forced a smile, the small recoil before she swallowed shame and kept dancing, lit a coal in his chest that he'd thought cold. Protection rose up instinctive and raw, welding him to the floorboards. He told himself he would leave after the supplies. He told himself a dozen things. But the next evening found him in the corner of the Scarlet Lily with a glass of whiskey turning bitter in his mouth, watching the copper-haired girl as she made a narrow orbit among men who treated her like a transaction. When a teamster, lurching on a temper made of too many miles and a bottle unkind to his manners, pressed himself too close and let his fingers decide where they should be, Elias stood. "Easy," he said, that low, deliberate sound of a man who'd put down more than one troublemaker with the same economy of words. The teamster sneered and shoved, the smell of cheap tobacco and stale sweat pushing at Elias's nostrils. Men like that calculate advantage. They let you walk away if you look too plain or laugh loudly. But Elias wore a colt at his hip like a promise, and his voice had been raised against rustlers and wolves. The teamster saw it, measured it, and moved on. The girl looked at Elias for a fraction that was all apology and suspicion. "Thank you," she murmured. "Name's Larkin," she said when he asked. "Larkin Hale." "And how old?" Elias asked, not to embarrass her, but because the look in her eyes said something the words might hide. 15, she said, and the number dropped to the floor between them, clinking like a coin too heavy for the room. Larkin had been orphaned 3 years before, when a fever had taken both her parents within days. Neighbors were supposed to step in, the county made arrangements, but law and mercy often spoke different tongues in Dry Creek. Her uncle Corbin Hale and his wife Myrna had taken her in. But their charity had been bartered for profit. They kept Larkin in a thin room above the kitchen, fed her on scraps, and when she reached an age where she could earn more than the price of bread, they sent her downstairs to dance. The Scarlet Lily purchased her as a resource. Corbin counted the coins she could raise. Family, he called it, when Elias called it something else. When Elias named a price, $500 in silver, counted out on the scarred table between lamplight and smoke, the room contracted as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Corbin's face, used to calculating gains from the grooves in a man's patience, changed in an instant, greed sharpening his features into a map of intention. Myrna made little noises with her mouth and propped a face of injured propriety. For Larkin, the numbers meant nothing. For Corbin and Myrna, the silver was a dream. Elias's hand didn't shake as he pushed the coins across. "Done," he said. "She comes with me tonight?" They left under a sky the color of old coins. The desert at night is a different country. The world softened, the stars close enough to imagine you could cup them in both hands. Larkin sat behind him on the mare, her smallness warm and trembling, her fingers knotted in the back of his shirt, as if she were gathering courage like thread. She had a small bag, a tattered dress of her mother's, a Bible with the names written in a spidery young hand, and a tintype of a wedding that had once promised a family. Everything. On the ride home, she asked the question that had been lodged in the hollow of her chest for years. "Why did you pay for me?" Elias felt the shrug in his bones. "Once I wanted the same things you did. Lost them. Maybe this is—" He paused, the desert air a knife that made thinking sharp. "Maybe this is chance someone's giving me to do right." Larkin's shoulders eased by a fraction. Hurt had taught her to mistrust gifts. The world paid itself back with interest. But this seemed different. Elias did not ask for favors. He did not smile like a man rehearsed for gain. He offered a steady hand, and a place with a porch swing and a barn where a girl could learn a different kind of work. Days in the Mercer place became small, kind miracles. Elias taught Larkin to saddle a horse properly, to listen to a mare's subtle sounds and know when something ached. He taught her the small sciences of survival in the West, how to read clouds for storms, how to find the cool shadow of an arroyo on blistering days, how to gut a fish without wasting anything. He taught her to hold a rifle with respect and accuracy, not for violence, but for protection. Above all, he taught her that worth was not measured in coin or in the wandering glance of men who stationed themselves in saloons. Larkin, who had been required to perform smiles like a craft, learned to laugh without calculation. She learned to plant a garden and coax tomatoes into fat, stubborn sweetness. She learned to read by lamplight and soon devoured books like they were a kind of feast. She surprised Elias with idioms and metaphors, phrases that had escaped the mouths of teachers and landed in her mind like seeds sprouting into comprehension. In return, she coaxed a softness into Elias's mouth that hadn't been there since Eleanor. He taught her to repair a fence, and, in the pauses where the sun silvered the fence posts, he taught her how to be a daughter. It should have been a long, quiet redemption, two broken people fitting ragged edges together. But the world has a way of testing mercy. Corbin Hale moved with a serpent's patience. Men who had been raised to reckon a person by what they could be made to produce do not like to see their wheels wrench free. He taped his worry into a letter to the sheriff and a contract the county clerk had insisted on. When guardianship had been formalized, Corbin and Myrna arrived one afternoon with Sheriff Amos Kincaid in his saddle, badge bright as a coin, the authority of ink and paper folded in the sheriff's breast. "She's still underage," Corbin said, with the practiced voice of a man who could make guilt sound like duty. "By law, she's our ward. The court names us." The sheriff's words were slow and careful. Laws were law. Papers were papers. Larkin met them at the porch. She had learned from Elias more than chores. She had learned to stand with something like defiance in her spine. "I won't go back," she said simply. The sentence was unadorned but honest. "I'm not going back to the Lily." Corbin's eyes were tight with the computation of losses. Myrna's mouth was a painted scowl that rattled with greed. The sheriff shifted in his saddle, his weight the first uneasy sign of a man who was law and also neighbor and who must balance both. What followed was not a shootout, but a quilt of courage from people who had the power of steady living rather than the flash of violence. Word spread the way it does in tight country. not as rumor, but as a summons. Neighbors came not in bodies to challenge the badge, but as testimony to the truth of what Larkin was becoming. Mabel Thatcher, the schoolteacher from 2 valleys over, arrived with the kind of courage that reads like a ledger in a ledgerless world. Precise, quietly furious at injustice. "She's learning to read and write and reason," Mabel said. "She's a pupil, not a thing for selling room and whiskey." Ranches sent their wagons, Ethan Boone, who kept a herd across the ridge, and his wife Celia, who could stitch up a child's heart with bread and song, Mr. Hank Rourke, the blacksmith whose hands were as honest as his hammer, who had stood up for men and animals for a generation, and others whose faces were familiar to Elias as the lines carved into weathered palms. They surrounded the sheriff with that peculiar county thing, not a call for lawlessness, but a community ledger. Nobody likes to be wrong in public, especially not a sheriff used to being right on paper. Sheriff Kincaid felt the weight of neighbors' disapproval, like a physical thing. The law is one thing, the spirit of it another. "Maybe," the sheriff said after a long, uncomfortable pause, "some things are more what they should be than what a piece of paper dictates." He folded the papers away, not as surrender, but as an acknowledgement that justice sometimes arrives through collective sight. Corbin and Myrna, robbed of the profit their scheme had promised, left muttering and thin threats that carried no teeth. The county would not back a man whose character had been placed on public trial and found wanting. When the dust settled, Larkin and Elias sat on the porch under a sky that had cooled into a wash of indigo. There were other tests yet to come: gossip in Dry Creek, the odd stare from a drifter who didn't like the idea of a girl who had been sold to a rancher, the quiet nights when the ache of what had been lost would sharpen like frost. But there were also small triumphs that glittered like tacked mirrors: neighbors bringing jams and jars of peaches in season, Mabel offering to tutor Larkin, young calves born healthy, and tugging on life with ridiculous determination. "You sure about this?" Larkin asked one evening, the lantern light painting their faces amber. She had a softness now that came from being fed and sheltered and, slowly, unlearned from the idea that safety was a luxury to earn. "I'm as sure as I can be," Elias said, and the truth in it had room for both pride and fear. "You'll always have a welcome here. I don't pretend to be a good man without flaws, but I'll be enough." "And what if you die?" she asked, the practical fear of a girl who had known too much mortality. He gave a small laugh that was almost a sob. "Then I hope someone brings you a toast and a pocket full of good advice. But, for now, you've got me." They taught each other how to be a family. Elias showed Larkin how to carve a spoon with the same fierce patience he once carved out a life. She showed him how to enjoy the light in ways that did not sting. He learned to tell stories again, not the kind that pretended the world was kinder than it is, but those small, tall tales that stitched together evenings. She learned to sing while shelling beans, the kind of music that built a house into a home. Some afternoons, when the sun slid like liquid gold and the cattle lined their shoulders along the fence like a row of sleeping gods, Elias would watch Larkin cross the yard and feel something settle in his ribcage that the name contentment might do. He had not known until then that grief could be companion enough for hope, not erasing memory, but making room for new memory to take root. The Scarlet Lily kept its doors open and its lanterns swinging. Dry Creek kept its talk. But Larkin Hale, who had walked through its wrongs, carved a life that refused to be defined by what had been taken from her. She grew into the kind of woman whose laughter was not measured in currency. She learned to write, and later, she wrote short notes to neighbors with recipes and small philosophy. Always salt the bread, always tend what you plant. Those notes, pinned to general store walls and barn doors, were read and reread like talismans. Years later, when a young girl came into the Mercer yard with dusty shoes and a story like a raw thing, Larkin, a woman who had learned to look people in the eye without bargaining for their worth, would take her by the hand and, without fuss, show her where to put a pot on a stove. Elias, older and with a new set of wrinkles, would make room on the porch swing. They would listen and they would act. Mercy was what they could afford, and it would be the best investment they made. Life on the Mercer Ranch was not a story without shadow. There were nights Elias woke and felt the weight of Eleanor's laugh gone. There were seasons of drought, and once, a fever that took more than it should have from a neighbor. But the house was full of resilience. The way a well-mended fence holds fast through wind. The way soup shared at a table is a kind of covenant. Their family, stitched from absence and small, brave acts, became a light for others. If this story settled with you, carry it forward. Tell someone about Larkin and Elias, or leave a note where folks might find it. Share the tale if it warmed your chest or stung it in a way that matters. Hit the like button if you read this on a platform that lets you do that. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories of quiet courage, and ring the bell so you won't miss the next one. Want more behind the scenes, character sketches, early drafts, or a reading? Drop a comment or follow the page and I'll bring them to you. If this story moved you, share it with a friend who needs a reminder that people can change and that kindness, small, stubborn kindness, still holds power.